Chapter 5. Sally had gone to bed by the time Pat Stevens got back to the ranch. The house lay dark and silent in the soft moonlight. Pat was glad Sally had gone to bed without waiting up for him. He hoped that she'd be asleep. It was an indication of the new feeling of security that had come to all of them in the valley. It was only the last few years that Sally had been able to force herself to turn in while her husband was still out. He thought back over those earlier days as he stopped his horse well back from the house to avoid waking Sally. He had never returned so late that a lit window hadn't told him that Sally was still up. He had a queer tightness in his belly as he remembered the look he had seen in Sally's eyes on some of those occasions she had waited at home without knowing whether or not he'd be coming back. It was tough on a woman, he reflected soberly as he ground-tied his horse and started towards the house, walking with care to make as little noise as possible. Lots harder on the women who sat at home and wondered and worried and imagined things than on the man who went out into the danger trusting his guns to carry him through. Lately, since he had been sheriff, Sally hadn't worried so much. She seemed to think the silver star of Laudum was some sort of magical symbol that protected a man from harm. Now, things were going to be different again. The old dangers were back, and the old fears would inevitably return with them. Once more, Sally would take to sitting in the living room with a light in the window while she prayed for his safety. All because of one man. All because of Eustace Arlo's ambitions to control the whole of Powder Valley. A cold rage burned inside Pat Stevens as he thought about it. It'd be the same all over the valley all after tonight. The feeling of security would be shattered by tonight's events. Neighbor would be taking sides against neighbor, and a fierce mistrust would drive wedges between the strongest friendships. It had already started, he recalled. His mouth was dry with anger and with a hopeless feeling of loss as he remembered the looks that were on the faces of Mr. Winters and John Boyd when they refused a drink with them in Harlow at the Gold Eagle. He wasn't angry at Winters or Boyd. He did think they might have trusted him further, might have searched their hearts and found the realization that Pat acted for the best when he turned Ezra over to the new sheriff, but he didn't blame them too much. They were honest and straightforward men who believed in meeting any challenge straight on, who couldn't compromise with the rights for the sake of expediency. His anger was directed at Eustace Arlo, who had brought about the situation that drove Pat to seemingly turn against his friends. He reached the front door and opened the screen door cautiously. He turned the knob and pressed down on the wooden door to keep the hinges from creaking as he went in. He moved across the living room cautiously, striking a match and shielding it between his palms, and found a lamp and lit it, turning the wick low so that it cast a faint yellow light across the room. He set the light on the center table and left it there, trusting it to throw a faint illumination through the hallway and into the door of the back bedroom where Sally was asleep on the big double bed. He hated to go into the bedroom because Sally was a light sleeper and likely to wake at the slightest noise, but his guns were in there, hanging over the two nails above the head of the bed. He had tried several times to leave his guns in another room where he could get at them in times like this without the risk of disturbing Sally, but she always found them and carried them back to the bedroom. She admitted that she did it because she couldn't bear the thought of him slipping in and getting them without her knowing about it. It was one of the persuasivenesses of Sally's nature that didn't make sense, but which she stubbornly clung to. Pat had tried to convince her that she would worry less if she didn't know when he came in for his guns, but she shuddered and declared obscenity that she would be worrying all the more when he was out. In the end, Pat gave up arguing with her and left the 2 cartridge-studded belts hanging from the wall at the head of the bed. He took off his boots and left them standing in the living room and began cautiously working down the hall in his sock feet. There was a loose board along there that creaked when he stepped on it. It had been loose for a long time, and Pat had meant to nail it down but kept forgetting about it. He cursed himself now for his negligence as he moved each foot along and felt for the board. He found it, and withheld his weight before it creaked under him. Then he took a long step and reached the closed bedroom door. His heart was pounding as he gently turned the knob. It was a crazy thing to be doing, creeping along through his own house like a thief, but right at the moment, it seemed the most important thing in the world was to get into the bedroom and out again without disturbing his sleeping wife. He sure didn't want to do any explaining to Sally. Not tonight. If he could get his guns and get out again without her knowing, she'd have one more night of good sleep anyway. He could leave a note for her on the kitchen table in case he wasn't back before she woke up in the morning, but if she awoke now... He had the door open, and the dim light behind him threw his shadow waveringly along across the bedroom and onto the wall. He could hear Sally's steady breathing now. The bed was right beside the door, and she was sleeping less than 2 feet from where he stood. He took another cautious step into the room and stood looking down upon her. Moonlight crept through the open window and lay lightly upon her slender form curled beneath a blanket. She slept on her side, turned away from the edge of the bed with her left palm beneath her cheek and her right arm flung forward, as though she sought in her sleep for the reassuring presence of her husband beside her. Her breath was strong and even. Pat loved her so much that it hurt as he stood there silently beside her. It was a wonderful kind of love that had grown between them during the dozen years that they had been married. It made the fierce passion of youth seem pale and inadequate by comparison. This was so much richer and deeper, built upon understanding and tolerance, compounded of mutual respect, and strengthened by all the misunderstandings that had come between them, an essence distilled from all the precious moments they had known together. Pat's hand strayed out and would have touched the soft blonde hair that lay like a halo about her face on the pillow if he hadn't checked himself. It was because of their love that he mustn't wake her now. He lifted his hand towards the heavy belt suspended from the wall above her head. He lifted one down soundlessly and transferred it to his right hand, and he had to lean a little further over her to reach the other gun belt. Sally stirred and turned her head on the pillow, and she opened her eyes and stared up at him, waking as easily and trusting as a child. "Is that you, dear?" "It's me." He lifted down the other belt, hoping that she would close her eyes again and not see what he was up to. Sally sat upright and clutched the blanket about her throat. Her eyes widened in the dim light and asked, "Are you coming to bed?" "Just a minute," Pat mumbled. He put both gun belts behind him to hide them from her searching gaze. "You got your guns," she cried out with a sharp note of alarm. "You're trying to slip out with them. You weren't going to wake me, Pat." "Well, I didn't want you to worry, old lady," Pat drawled defensively. When he called her old lady in that tone, Sally knew he was badly upset. She threw the cover aside and reached down beside the bed for a pair of beaded moccasins, warning him, "Don't you dare go off without telling me about it." She stood up and caught hold of his arm tightly. "It ain't much," he lied. "Some of the boys drank a little too much beer in town and figured I might have to lock some of 'em up." "And you rode all the way to get your guns just for that?" Sally scoffed at him. "You know you can never lie to me, Pat." He sighed deeply He knew he couldn't. Not and get away with it. He went out of the living room and Sally followed him out in her white muslin nightgown that came all the way down to her moccasin feet with a gathering of blue ribbon about the throat. She looked like a slender and frightened little girl standing there in the yellow lamplight. Pat couldn't stand to look at her. He couldn't meet her accusing eyes. He lowered his gaze and became very busy swinging the heavy belts about his waist and settling the heavy holsters low on each hip. Sally studied him in complete silence, and when she finally spoke, there was a queer little catch in her voice. "You've forgotten your star again, dear," Pat said heavily. "I haven't forgotten, Sally." He jerked one of the belts tighter than necessary and forced the brass tongue of the buckle into the last hole. He drew in a deep breath and looked at her. "I've done resigned." Sally didn't move. Her arms hung straight down at her sides, and she balled her hands up into fists in a convulsive and involuntary reaction of his words, and she echoed, "Resigned?" And the single word resounded thunderously in Pat's ears in the night silence that followed. He swallowed down a lump in his throat and grinned wryly. "That's right. Some of the fellas decided maybe I've been sheriff of Powder Valley long enough and I'd ought to give some other Jasper a chance." "Who?" Sally's voice was like a whiplash. "Why, just some of the fellas." "Who did they give your star to?" "A waddy by the name of Trippo." Sally caught her lower lip between her teeth and she said, "I don't know anyone named Trippo." "He's from down Texas way. He's kind of new to the valley, and you know the old saying about a new broom sweeping clean." Sally went to him quickly. "You're not telling me the truth, Pat. Not all of it. Was that why you weren't invited to the meeting tonight? Is that why Ezra didn't want you to go? Because he knew your supposed friends were going to vote you out of the sheriff's job behind your back, after all you've done for the valley?" "Well, I reckon Ezra and some of the others thought maybe that it'd be easier on me not being there," Pat admitted uncomfortably. "Oh, Pat, how could they do a thing like that to you?" Sally's small fist pounded on his shoulder and tears of anger came into her eyes. "Damn them! Oh, damn!" "Oh, shh!" Pat grinned and put a big hand over her mouth. "Cussing right out loud," he reproved her. "You're getting pretty tough in your old age." "I mean it," she said stoutly. "I'd say worse if I knew the right words. It's mean and cruel of them to do that. Just let me find out which ones voted against you, and I'll tell them a thing or two. "No, Sally," said Pat sharply. "They're not to blame. Not one of them. They're caught. They had to vote right when Harlow cracked the whip." "Harlow?" "That's right. It was him that engineered the whole deal. Trippo is his right-hand man, and they wanted him for sheriff instead of me. So Mr. Harlow started pulling some strings. You see, a lot of people owe him money, Sally. He's been loaning money right free-like to anyone who wanted some." "What reason would he have for wanting another sheriff?" "He claims he has cattle rustled, and I ain't done nothing to stop it." "Has he?" "I don't know. He claims that Ezra stole a dozen head of his blooded stuff and has them in his pasture right now. He made it look like they ain't done a thing because Ezra's my partner." "Oh, Pat, how terrible! You know Ezra wouldn't steal a thing." "Sure, I know it, but I reckon he'll have proof. I'm not doubting there's a dozen head of his stuff in Ezra's pasture right now." "Then he must have put them there," Sally said fiercely. "Yeah, I reckon that's the way of it." "Then Ezra ought to get out there and run them back onto the VX ranch where they belong." Pat sighed. Trouble is, Ezra can't do it. Not right now.
Why not?
He's in jail. Sally drew back and stared into Pat's face in consternation.
You mean the new sheriff arrested Ezra already? It's a good thing Sam wasn't there. With him always carrying his gun in town, there would have been trouble for sure. I'm sure glad you weren't wearing yours tonight.
Sam was there, Pat told her gently.
Oh, is he all right? I mean, he didn't get hurt, did he?
He's all right, except for a bit of a bump on the chin.
Then there was a fight. Well, tell me about it. Don't just stand there like a bump on a log. What happened? Was there any shooting?
Pat shook his head. I had to hit Sam, he said briefly, and then I took his gun and held it on Ezra and walked him out to the new sheriff. That's all there is to tell. Sally took a step backwards, her blue eyes rounding in disbelief.
You knocked Sam down and then marched Ezra out with Sam's gun?
That's right.
But you weren't sheriff anymore. You didn't have to help arrest Ezra. How could you do a thing like that to Ezra and Sam?
Seemed like a good idea, Pat said mildly. He leaned down to pull on his boots.
Why'd you come home for your guns? Where are you going now?
Well, I thought I'd take a little ride. Pat's voice was grim. He didn't look at Sally.
It's trouble, isn't it? She asked in a subdued voice. You're not giving up so easily. You're going to go fight Eustace Arlo and his gang of gunfighters.
Well, I hate to see a fella like that come in here and mess up the valley.
But they got the law on their side now, and they'll be laying for you, Pat. There'll be just you and your 2 guns against them all.
There's been times before when the law was against me, Pat reminded her with bleak quietude. Couple of times I can remember when you knew I was going up against something like that, and one of them times there was only the 2 of us, you and me, against the law in the whole of the valley. Sally's face tightened, and she nodded her head slowly.
I'm thinking of those times myself. Oh, darling, I thought all that had ended. I thought we could go on and just live here peacefully.
Unfortunately, when there's men like Eustace Arlo wanting to crowd other folks off ranches that's rightfully theirs, you wouldn't want me backing down from something like that, though, would you?
No, Pat, Sally told him gravely. I wouldn't want you to back down from fighting what's right. Ever.
She went to him steadily and put her hands on his shoulders, and she lifted her face to his, and there was an unafraid smile upon her lips. Her eyes were alight with a radiance born of the frontier spirit within her.
I knew you wouldn't turn your back on Sam and Ezra. You go on out there with your guns, and you show those people that men of Powder Valley will still fight for their homes.
Pat said awkwardly, You know, you're mighty wonderful, Miss Old Lady. He kissed her on the lips and held her tight for a moment, then put her away from him, and then turned and walked out the door. Sally stood in the middle of the floor and watched him go. Her eyes were mist with tears that she couldn't see him, but the smile remained on her lips, and there was a hard pounding of pride within her breast. End of chapter 5.